My name's Tim Atkinson. I'm the Theatre Building Services Advisor at the Theatres Trust, and I'm running the eco-venue programme and project that the Trust has been undertaking for the last year or so. I'm joined by Helen Heathfield, Director of Energy and Environment at Julie's Bicycle. And it's our intention to really talk over the subject of display energy certificates, and also to launch our next phase of work with display energy certificates, which is the theatre's DEC pool. I'll be up first. I know we have some people here who've got display energy certificates within their building, and I'll be very keen to hear your experiences of them, both towards the beginning of my presentation, but after Helen's spoken, we'd be very interested to sort of chat about the subject sort of between everyone. So I know people have very differing experiences of obtaining them, why they've obtained them, and what happens next. So if you're all happy, I shall crack on over here. As I said, my name's Tim Atkinson. I joined the Theatres Trust at the beginning of last year to run the eco-venue project. The Theatres Trust itself is the national advisory public body for theatres in the United Kingdom. The majority of our work is as a planning consultee. We're a statutory consultee under the Town and Country Planning Act, and most of our planning work fairly predictably relates to theatre buildings, past and present, and in a lot of cases future. The Trust was set up by Act of Parliament in 1976. We are a non-departmental public body, and as such are independent. The eco-venue project itself, which is where my major level of involvement arrives, mainly arose from the 2008 Theatres Trust Conference, which was on building sustainable theatres and looking at aspects of sustainability in new builds. As following on from that later in the year, and some of you may be in a round at PLASA that September, the Mayor of London launched the Green Theatre Plan, which was a collaborative effort involving the Theatres Trust, Julie's Bicycle, industry suppliers such as White Light, and theatre buildings themselves, looking at how theatres work, what levels of sustainability they currently have, or currently had, I should say. Nobody had really looked into the area before, so it was all a real fact-finding mission and a mission of discovery. The headline chart, I suppose, that came from the Mayor of London's Green Theatre Plan, and I'm not going to read you the whole plan, was this chart looking at the breakdown of energy use within a theatre, a typical theatre, whatever a typical theatre is. The, unsurprisingly, but really the first time it had been put into figures, the stage lighting contributed only really about 9% of a theatre's energy spend. By far the greatest majority of energy went on conditioning the environment front of house, with a further 28% going on rehearsal space. The eco-venue project itself, having reacted, I suppose, in a way, to the reactions of the larger chains. The larger chains and the larger venues, following the publication of that report, started undertaking big work themselves and continue to that end. However, the smaller and medium-sized venues weren't in a position, be it through funding or staffing or even knowing really where to turn, they weren't in a position to make those same strides. So the Trust applied to the European Regional Development Fund for funding to work with those theatres. It's match funded by the Theatres Trust, and we're working with 48 small to medium-sized performing arts venues across London, ranging from pub theatres to traditional proscenium arch to converted warehouses. There's a huge variance in building types. The venues have been joining us quarterly since April last year, and the project runs until the summer of next year, at which point there will be an externally authored report. Because of the funding mechanism of the European Regional Development Fund, the funding comes through the London Development Agency, which is what keeps it a London project. But the DEC pool that we'll be talking about today is very much a national element to the project. So why display energy certificates? Why are we specifically getting so hung up on display energy certificates? Some of you will have them, I know, but you may not be aware of where they came from. They were a direct response to the European Performance of Buildings Directive and EPBD2, or son of EPBD. It was introduced and is monitored in the UK by the Department for Communities and Local Government and has been running since October 2008. Theoretically, it is enforced by the weights and measures bodies, which for most people is trading standards. There's an interesting feedback loop there, but we'll come on to that later. Who is supposed to have one? Well, here is the clear as mud guidance on who is supposed to have a display energy certificate. Buildings occupied or part occupied either by a public authority or institution that provides a public service and that expect to be visited by the public to a large number of persons and who are therefore frequently visited by those persons and with a total floor area greater than 1,000 square metres. Is that a theatre? Is that a local authority? It certainly was intended to cover local authority buildings, such as housing offices, benefit offices, government estate. Whether that then applies to privately owned properties, but you could still argue provide a public service and are frequently visited by a large number of persons. It's open to a lot of interpretation, and our experience so far across the 48 venues that we're working with in EcoVenue is that some councils have asked for their estate buildings to have them and some of them haven't. What does a DEC look like? The chances are, if you're here, you already know. But this is a general look of a DEC. Looks much like the A to G rating that you would get on a new fridge or white goods, and increasingly across other products and services. A is a 0 to 25. G is anything over 150. Now, G is an interesting area because it has changed since DECs were introduced. You can now, if you've had a recent DEC, you can score as much as 9,999, which is a bit of a shocker. But the idea was, because a DEC is based on your energy bills and can only be based on actual energy bills, if you do not have a year's worth of data to base them on, you will automatically score a G. And the 9,999 figure is indicative of where there is a lack of information to base it on. So, and I know that there are some theatres in the country with 9999 scores. It doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that the data wasn't available. However, in some of the earlier DECs, a G was, if you didn't have the correct billing, you automatically scored a G, but that was seen as a 200 score. So beware of Gs, they're a little bit misleading. Why are we interested in DECs specifically? Well, initially, everyone really needs to be aware that the government has consulted on rolling out the DEC scheme to all commercial premises. That's seen as an encouragement to business to advertise its performance and improve its performance. We're interested in that because that has quite a big knock-on effect for theatres. In a way, it's easier for some of the larger venues to accommodate a DEC, but for some of the smaller venues, the cost involved in obtaining them can equate to a week's takings. I mean, and that's a huge impact to suddenly have to front up with. Sorry, I'll just pop back. But one of the main reasons we're interested in DECs is that there is currently only one benchmark in the system that relates to theatres, and that's the entertainment halls category. So regardless of whether you're West Yorkshire Playhouse, a pub venue, Wembley Stadium, you are all benchmarked by the same information. And that's why we're really interested in this. As a tool, DECs allow us to gauge the environmental performance of theatres year on year. You'll see on a certificate the current year's performance and the previous 2 years' performance, so you can see which direction you're heading in. We want to use the DECs to investigate the issues facing theatres across the UK as they try to become more sustainable, because we're aware that there is a variation in how the year-on-year scores work. Does a lower score in the following year really mean that the performance is lowered? And this research allows us to inform future, more accurate benchmarks by developing an evidence base. And that's very key to what we're doing and what Julie's Bicycle are doing as well. It'll also allow us to educate all in best practice. So why did the Theatres Trust turn into debt collectors? DECs and advisory reports are documents of public record. If you are legally obliged to have a DEC, you have to display it at no less than A3 size at your main public entrance. That's a big piece of paper. If you've got a G, for whatever reason, or an F, or an E, or an A, if you've got an A, it's quite a statement to make. If you've got a G, it's something that some people might want to hide, but it's hard to hide A3 in your foyer. However, despite being a document of public record, you cannot search for them online. If you see a DEC in a building and take down its certificate number, you can look it up and you can look up all the reports that went with that. But then you're in the physical presence of the DEC anyway. So what we're trying to do is pull together DEC information. For what it's worth, in the consultation regarding whether DECs would be rolled out commercially, another question was, would you like the database to be publicly searchable? For what it's worth, the Trust replied yes, but in the change of government, the whole thing seems to have slightly disappeared under a mountain of other things. So I honestly don't know where we're going with that. We've been collecting DECs since 2009 through the volunteering of information by theatres and venues. We're carrying out DECs as part of the Eco Venue project to look at what those buildings, how they're performing. And this is very new. The Centre for Sustainable Energy put in a Freedom of Information request to the Department for Communities and Local Government to publish the database, and they were successful. And the full database of DECs was released by CLG. Now, as I start to talk through the data, it's no secret from the people who've already looked at it, and it's pretty obvious once you start looking at it. There are some major flaws in the data, and it's hard to know whether those flaws pre-existed on the database, so the initial information gathered for the DECs was wrong, or whether in the publication of the database it's become corrupted. For example, a small art centre in London is listed on the published database as having a floor area of 30,000 square metres. I don't believe it myself, and having been there, I know it's not true. But we only have this data to work with. So all the data that you do see throughout today, it's not that we think it's wildly inaccurate, but it's very hard to get a level of authenticity and know what level of authenticity that is. So what have the DECs that have been published and the information that we've got from our sources and from the Centre for Sustainable Energy FOI request, what do they tell us? Well, if you are a venue with a DEC, and would you mind putting your hand up if you are at a venue with a DEC? So we've got two here. Do you mind me asking what year you got your first DEC?
We've only had it done at the beginning of this year, so
okay.
It was December 2010.
Okay.
And we're on our second year.
And you're on your second year. 2008 was the beginning of the scheme, and it started in October. So you can see there were only 73 venues that we can identify so far on this list. There is a digit missing from that. The average operational rating was 67, for what it's worth. Apologies for that. And I've put DNF equals 7 as being a did not finish. I've tried to weed out those that got the Gs because they didn't have enough data, because I think it unfairly skews those results. But if you can see that the vast majority were Bs and Cs. A few Gs, very few Fs and very few As. Something that we've been looking into is, do bigger or smaller venues score better or worse? And our experience with the venues in the Eco Venue project is that small venues score very highly almost always A's or B's. Now, as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at these venues, you have a gut feeling for a building and how efficient it is. And I know that some of those buildings perhaps don't deserve an A or a B, but you sort of think, well, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. But what we actually see looking at the decks that are on the published database is you're actually more likely to get, only just, but you are more likely to get a better deck the larger your floor area. In 2009, things started to move around a bit. The average operational rating went down a bit to 58, i.e. better, remembering that 0 is the top score. At 6 DNFs, and again, the majority split between B and C, a very similar scatter for floor area. And finally, in 2010, once again, a similarly representative or similarly representative chart. More A's. The average has gone. The average went down slightly in 2010. I'm sorry, at some point in pasting these graphs in, it's dropped that operational rating. And less venues failed to score at all because they didn't have the data. We started to get bigger venues involved. That's the only major change in the scatter. But again, larger the venue, slightly more likely to get a higher score. Now, a reason I brought this one back in is theoretically, 100 would be typical of a venue score. So is that how it panned out? No. That arrow indicates that were 100 to be typical, you'd be looking at the general trend of venues being somewhere over here. And I was speaking to Rupert earlier from Lawrence Batley, who was saying that they were somewhat surprised to get a B the first time they went into it. And as I mentioned, in actual fact, it seems that you would be almost surprised not to get a B at the moment. I think that may have reassured a lot of venues. I think a lot of places were reluctant to go into the scheme thinking, oh, how are we going to end up? And were pleasantly surprised to score a B. But what does that mean? Well, it really means, I think, that the benchmarks aren't quite what they could be. So if 100 is typical, how do we rate the performances across the country of decks? How do we say that this venue is genuinely this much better than another venue? But in the short, medium, and probably long term, we're going to need to contextualize it in the sector, and that means really sharing information. So that alongside displaying your deck, you're also going to say, well, okay, this is the deck, and this is how it works on the national benchmark, but actually in theatres in the UK, this is where we fit in. We also need to take this information beyond the sector. And to do that, we need to, or by taking it beyond the sector, we can feed the information that we get back, the genuine information that we know to be true about our venues, how big they are, when they're open, whether we've got catering, whether they haven't got catering, whether you're a producing house, whether you're a music venue. We need to take that information and feed it back to where the benchmarks do come from. So today we are launching the Theatre's Deck Pool. It's voluntary, it's in-depth, it's achieved by interrogating the venues themselves. No one knows venues like the people who run them and work with them. They know what's true and what isn't true. Survey is a partnership with Julie's Bicycles Green Venues database, and Helen will talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. This will be coming your way. As the Trust, we have a vast quantity of information on the number of theatres in the UK, where they are, who they are, and to some extent how big they are and how old they are. But we need a lot more if we're actually going to make any meaningful, or take any meaningful information from the decks and contribute that back to CIBC, who are the monitoring body, the benchmarking body. It will allow planning for the future direction of theatre planning and advice. That's the role of the Trust, and that's a role that we take on with you as theatre users and owners. It will help theatres themselves to begin to see where they fit into sustainability in the sector. If you're in a converted church in Barnsley and someone else is in a converted church in Tunbridge Wells, the converted church in Tunbridge Wells might have an A and the one in Barnsley might have a B. One of them might have a G, one of them might have an F. But if we can put those people in touch to share best practice, then that can only be a good thing across the board. The DEC pool will allow real contextual data to inform the next series of benchmarks in a way that's relevant to the actual industry through feedback to the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. CIBSE are very keen to hear from us, and I think, are you likely to touch on that? CIBSE are very keen to hear what the sector has to offer. And I think Helen's experience and my experience in chatting to various people involved in these things is they're always impressed how the theatre sector and the entertainment sector is really kind of taking this on. And as a result, they're really keen to hear what we've got to say. The data will take account of age of building, size, hours of operation, listing status, to build a full profile of the building stock. It's a thorough online survey, so it's not reams of paper, which is also a good thing, but it'll add to the information that the Trust already holds. If you want to get involved, and we would really love you to get involved, even if you don't have a DEC but you have a venue, bearing in mind that you may have to get a DEC within the next few years, we'd still love your information. So either leave your details today and I'll be around to collect your information at the end of the seminar. Alternatively, email me at theatresdecpool@theatrestrust.org.uk. Alternatively, if we have your information on the Trust database, we will email this out to everybody. So keep your eyes peeled for it. For more general information about the eco-venue project and where we're going with it, you can email me. My details are there. You can visit the website at ecovenue.org.uk. You can follow us on Twitter. We also have a quarterly showcase in Theatres magazine, which is the Trust's magazine. There are copies on our stand. Also, there's a summary of the articles so far, which I think you can pick up from the stand, or more you've been giving out, haven't you? And from there, I'd like to hand over to Helen, after which I'd be really interested to hear from those who've got DECs, and also from those of you who haven't got DECs, in a way, why you're here and what you are interested in and where you see this going. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So can I just check, who's heard of Julie's bicycle? Hands up. Wow, great. So for those of you who haven't heard, oh wow, my text has disappeared. Gosh. Oh, it's only going to be the headings. Dear me.
Do you want your...
Excuse me, technical breakdown. Yeah, what's going to be the best way of doing it? Cool.
Open your original.
Cool. Do you mind? Right, so apologies for that. Just sorting out the technical issue. But so, Julie's Bicycle is a small not-for-profit organisation that's interested in the cultural and creative sector improving its environmental performance. And we're doing that with all kinds of venues, music festivals, galleries, all kinds of cultural and creative organisations. And we're very, very grateful to Theatres Trust for allowing us to join in with this survey, because we've added in questions that are really about what the venues are actually doing. It's really, really great that we're looking at the display energy certificates and the energy information, but we're also, with all of our work with different kind of venues, we recognise that there's how the venue is performing, but then there's this range of different things that the venue can be doing to make a difference. And it's almost this kind of alchemical mix of needing someone senior to care, maybe needing something written on a piece of paper, needing someone in all the different departments to come together. And yeah, this strange alchemy, and we want to understand, because we're seeing it really working in some venues and then really just seeing barriers in other venues. So we've put in these questions that are about what you're doing. You know, have you got some kind of policy? Are you understanding on a daily or a weekly or some kind of regular basis what your meter readings are? And what are you actually doing to improve behaviour, to improve the systems, to improve the lighting? And have you sought or gained any accreditation or awards? So things like BS 8901 or the Green Tourism Awards, or there are many awards out there. We're taking these questions beyond theatres to a wider range of venues, and we're doing this because we care, basically. We want to improve the environmental performance of all of these venues. We're caring because that quote there on the left from Katie Tunstall shows that the artists sometimes want to be able to talk about environmental performance, and they can't really, with integrity, until their supply chain sorts itself out. So we're very much looking at how the supply chain can sort itself out. We've also done some work looking at how much the cultural and creative sectors can save, and just looking at the venues that we hope to be working with over the next 3 years. We've calculated a financial saving from energy and gas bills of 35 million over the next 3 years. That's just on current energy prices. Most of the theatres that we've been talking to over the last couple of months are seeing quotes back from their energy brokers that their energy bills are going to be increasing by 10% to 30% over this next year. So energy is getting more expensive, which would mean that those savings would be even bigger and even more important. The main thing we want to do with these questions that we're gathering from this survey, though, is putting the venues that are, really doing something, demonstrably doing something, into our Green Venues database. So that's a database that will be hosted on the Julie's Bicycle website that will allow people to search for the different kind of venue that they need, whether they're some kind of festival program manager or some kind of artist, some kind of artistic director, looking at what the different options are according to what they need. We've also got tools for you that we just want you to be using. So we've got the industry green tools, for example, first of all, that allow venues to enter in annual or monthly information from energy, water and waste, and potentially business travel and audience travel as well, if you have it. And we just want to increase awareness of those and get more information flowing in through those. They're completely free, and it's starting to improve on that kind of baseline information that we might be getting from the display energy certificates, and expanding that out to all the different kinds of venues, people who just haven't got a DEC or aren't bothered about getting one just now, getting information from all of them as well. And also getting information through the SMeasure tool, which the eco venues are using, which is actually getting weekly meter readings for electricity and gas, and normalising that according to the outdoors temperature, so that you start to get an understanding of how your building is responding in severe weather during the winter. So all of that information coming together so that we start to get a much better idea of how venues are performing. And Tim has already touched on this, but CIBSE, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, that manages that average 100 kilowatt hours per metre squared that the average entertainment hall is supposed to be responsible for, recognise that that is rubbish.
Could be refined.
Could be refined. I'm not very political. Could be refined, and they're aware with the information that we already have that we could probably significantly improve on that benchmark. What we're aware of, as we're starting to analyse some of the data that we already have, is that per metre squared just isn't that useful. What we're starting to see is per seat, and per seat per performance is much more useful for venues, especially when there's a dark period during the year, and just per seat seems to be a much better recognition of the scale of a venue rather than metre squared. But we're sort of playing around with the data and seeing, what makes the most sense. Because in the end, we want something that's useful to you. We want you to know that compared to all the different kind of other, for example, medium-sized theatres, that you are better than average or worse than average, and then can pick out particular venues that you might be able to learn from. You know, per seat, per show, how are you getting on? And we've already been able to do that, for example, within the 12 London producing theatres. They've all started to share their energy data. And so I've been able to look at a kilowatt hours per seat basis and rank them all. And there was one venue manager, he was worried that his theatre wasn't performing well, and I have been able to tell him that, yeah, he's one from the bottom, he's he's 11 out of 12. So that's useful information to know, actually, to sort of almost to maybe to have your fears, you know, kind of recognise that they're valid, so that you then have something to go to the financial manager and say, look, we could be doing so much better. Other venues in the group have got kilowatt hours per seat half of what they're doing. That's a really, really significant cost impact, and shows that really significant investments in maybe the building fabric or the building services, or maybe just in behaviour, could save them a significant amount of money. So it's that kind of value that we're interested in coming out of these benchmarks, that it improves behaviour. I mentioned the accreditation and ways that venues can be rewarded. There are already 11 venues that we've rewarded with our Industry Green mark. So these are 11 venues that have provided information to us about how they're committing to improving their environmental performance, that they're understanding and measuring it using the Industry Green tools, that they're improving their performance, and we're going back to them year on year and finding out, are they actually making reductions in their energy bills or not? And then finally, how are they communicating about it? We want to know how they're communicating to incoming productions, if that's relevant, to audience, internally within staff, to directors and other interested stakeholders. So venues are starting to see the point in talking about this stuff and doing something about it. And I think as more and more venues talk about it, it becomes normal. You know, this just needs to become part of business as usual, rather than some special added on thing that people don't quite have the time to get round to. So what next for us is looking at how we can improve that display energy certificate benchmark. And we've met recently with CIBSE, who definitely are going to be using our data. They've in fact given a special dispensation for us to, jointly between the two of us, to analyse that data ourselves, so that obviously particular venues have got concerns about you know, their energy bills entering the sort of public domain, even if it's just one of the CIBSE's, you know, internal experts. So we're going to be analysing that data internally ourselves, so that it remains completely anonymous and safe, and providing advice back to CIBSE about how they can improve that benchmark, and potentially look at how there needs to be a small venue benchmark and a large venue benchmark, or maybe it needs to be per seat rather than per metre squared. Now that just might be too much for CIBSE and the government to deal with, and so we're already also talking to them about how we might have co-display of information. So you'll have your display energy certificate saying A or G or whatever it is, and then next to it saying and what we are actually like really compared to other theatres is this, and this is what we're doing about it, and much more, you know, specific data for your type of venue, your size of venue, that just makes a lot more sense. And CIBSE are very happy to start talking about having, you know, 2 pieces of information up there, which I think is really useful. And in the end, I am a complete energy and carbon geek, and I love playing around with all of this information, and that isn't the point. This is not for my intellectual gratification. It's so that your venues are being run better, that you're saving money, so that more information is going into the cultural and creative content, rather than just up into, you know, hot air leaking out of your building, and how that can lead to happier staff, happier audiences, happier artists, and I've got to admit it, a happier me as well. So that's what we're up to, and we'd really like to hear what you're up to as well. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a quick chat with Rupert and Pat before the seminar started, before the show, revealing my roots here. And I just wondered if I could ask Rupert what led you to get a DEC, and just talk about whether you were perhaps beaten into doing it, or whether you actually actively pursued it yourselves, and if so, why, and how you found it. Could you act on it, and might you act on it?
Right. Yes. My venue is Lawrence Batley Theatre in Huddersfield. It is an 1829 Methodist mission, which has gone through several changes in its lifetime, and has been the Lawrence Batley Theatre since 1994. It is a theatre trust, but it is also partly funded and looked after by Kirklees Theatre Trust. 2 years ago, I came here and was talking to Moira about, well, I was interested in the whole debt pool and trying to make or find out information about getting money, grants, ideas to actually make my venue greener. And we got talking about the debt pool. I took that back, talked to my venue managers about progressing these ideas, and that sort of came at the same time as DECs becoming more widely required. Again, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the council, who were very, very proactive in many areas as far as wanting to go greener. So I was actually able to say to them, please can we have one? With very little badgering afterwards. They actually came and did it, and as I say, in December last year, we received our certificate, which has put us in the B category. That also came with the what's the word? The report, the advisory report, of which actually an awful lot of it we've already started to be able to do, because it is down to more loft insulation or changing to low energy light bulbs, all of which we're in the process of doing, trying to find money to do, and yeah, we're getting there slowly. We're meeting the 3 month and 6 month or whatever it is in the first year sort of time scales, and without too much pain at the moment. Again, as I say, we've been able to badger Kirklees into allowing us to join up with their energy suppliers through YPO, which is saving us an awful lot of money. But that is also allowing us to become part of the central energy management of the council, which is highlighting the fact that we need more help and services and provision to become greener, to meet their carbon footprint requirements. So it sort of is working on many fronts, and I think I'm hoping that it will continue to do so and continue to actually be useful to us. Exactly where a B stands us now and where we'll be in December 2011, 2012 will be interesting to see. But I think it is a definite way forward.
Thank you very much. On the subject of where you might be 1 year on, I might just ask Pat to say a few words about your venue, because you've had a few decks now, and your results have changed over time.
Yeah, okay. I'm Philip Cymru in Mold in North Wales. We're a fairly unusual beast in that we're a producing theatre who are directly operated by the local authority. So there was no ambiguity about whether we ought to have a deck or not. The county council has an energy efficiency department who organised a deck for us as soon as we gave them a little push. We came out with a B, which we thought was very good, because we thought where a theatre would be dreadful. And on thinking about it, we thought, oh, well, actually, maybe that's reasonable enough. We're a relatively modern building. We opened in 1976. We get a lot of solar gain, for instance, because we've got extensive glazing. We haven't got any air conditioning, so we can't waste energy cooling ourselves down. So we thought, surprising, but there we go. And we actually also came out much better than the rest of the county council offices, who were very much worse than us in terms of energy use. And again, when we thought about that, we thought probably floor area had a lot to do with that, because although our building, in terms of volume, is quite big, when you actually, because so much of it is big spaces, the floor area doesn't work out quite the same way. So we assumed that there must be something going on there. So that was a B in the first year. When it came time to do it again, we came out with a C. We thought, oh, what have we slipped on? We couldn't think of anything. We'd been doing the same sorts of shows with the same sorts of extensive lighting rigs. We'd had the same sort of number of people coming through the building. We thought the weather had been roughly similar year on year. And we actually came down to the conclusion that there's a certain amount of randomness is an unkind word, but the assessing must have an element of subjectiveness to it. That's particularly true for us because we're part of the local authority and we're situated on a whole civic complex with the main county headquarters and the county library and the county courts and so on. The whole campus is metered as one unit by the utility companies, and there's then an internal financial provision that goes on within the county about portioning those energy costs out to the various buildings. And that made us start thinking about how accurate that was. And we've come to the conclusion that we've actually probably been on the raw end of the deal there. Our building, for instance, used to have a fully functioning TV studio in it, with lots of very high power lights burning lots and lots of the time. And historically, we think that the apportioning of energy around the county was took account of that, which is no longer true. Although that doesn't really account for why our debt should have moved from D to a C in the course of 2 recent years. But we think that the, as you were saying, the benchmarking and the consistency of the certificate, both from between venues and also from year to year, particularly if it's different assessors doing it each year, must be something that comes into it. And that's why a much more thorough benchmarking process will be really interesting.
Thank you very much. Has anybody, obviously there are a few people, only a couple of, only those two gentlemen put their hands up when I asked who had a deck. That must mean the rest of you are here for either an idle curiosity or an aversion to sunshine. I just wondered, is there anything that anyone would like to bring up that brings you here or makes you curious? Are any questions that you'd like to ask either myself or Helen, or perhaps even Pat and Rupert if they'd be happy to join in?
Can I just, Kieran Millis from the National Theatre Engineering Department. Just interesting what you just said there about the inconsistencies. Tim, is that right? You are an assessor as well. We're just about to have one done. We don't need to get one done, but we're going to get one done. And is it your experience that, I mean, when you went through the assessment process and you were trained, I mean, how
Theoretically, when you're putting, well, more than theoretically, when you put together a DEC, you have a nominated start date which should be agreed between the assessor and the venue. So it can be quite tricky to pin down because there's a certain amount of variation. It comes down to whether you get your gas and electric bills on the same day of the same month. There's a certain account taken in for variation, about 15 days either side. Once you've pinned that date down, that should be the beginning of your metered energy use for that calendar year, and there should be an end point 365 days later. That is then fed into an assessment tool, usually OrCalc, which is the government-provided assessment tool, along with your floor area. And at its most basic, the DEC is an assessment of your kilowatt hour per square metre energy use. Now, it is tempered by weather data, so it should take into account variations in your local weather. It's very postcode based, so it should tie the local Met Office weather station into your point. The idea there is very much that if you're running a venue, say in the extreme north of the country, versus a venue in the extreme southwest of the country, the mitigations and adjustments are such that you don't score disproportionately high or low depending on your location. So there should be no variation in that sense. There's no discretion on the part of the assessor as to where you score. There is the only point really that discretion comes into it, if that's the right word, is the assessment of floor area. Now, the first time you get a DEC done, a floor area calculation will have to be made. Now, that can be done from scale plans, or it can be done in the absence of scale plans, and some of the older venues that's an issue. It can be done by manually measuring the building. That is obviously quite a subjective process. Without getting too much into it, there are areas of a building that can be ignored from a DEC. If they have specialised uses, the only real example that might apply to a theatre is that if you had a server room that actually ran the box office servers for other venues that were off-site, that energy use for that metres squared can be disregarded because it's seen that the energy is being used elsewhere and it's therefore not fair to apportion that to that one building. But obviously metres squared or the floor area is something of a subjective judgment. In the CIBC benchmarks, for example, only the stalls area is taken into account. Circles and balconies are not. Now, whether that's fully made aware to local energy assessors, it's hard to say. And something that I've started to look at but not had time to look into in any depth is looking at the Freedom of Information Request database. It's clear that a variety of benchmarks have been used and applied to these theatres. Now, that might be because, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you're dealing with, say, the West Yorkshire Playhouse, it's a theatre. If you're dealing with an arts centre that has the local music service and other venues involved, or other operations involved, perhaps it's less clear whether that is a theatre and an entertainment building. So, and I think that's where the variations can come in, and that's where the subjective nature of it may fall on the assessor. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely.
In theory, and this would obviously vary assessor to assessor, when you come to do a second year DEC, as long as there's been no substantial change to the building, it's more than likely that the assessor who does the subsequent report will take the same floor area as was on the previous report. And it's up for debate within the energy assessment industry whether what they call drive-by DECs and drive-by energy certificates are becoming more and more common. when you put a deck together, in theory, you have to photograph the building and photograph the plant and equipment you saw to prove that you were there, because otherwise you could be sent a set of scale plans and the energy bills and just do a deck from your desk. So they've only got your word for it that your building hasn't changed. So year on year, it's worth kind of keeping an eye on whether they're using the same floor area. I would guess they would, because it's easier for them. Something certainly that we're looking at is how you standardise that methodology across theatres. You know, are we sure that all energy assessors are discounting the circles and balconies, for example? So, yeah. Nick?
Tim, the business of splitting metering up into different areas, I've heard several people say it's prohibitively expensive. Is it?
I think it depends on who you talk to, and I think it depends on how friendly your energy company is and how much you're worth to them, sadly. I think you get varying levels of proactivity or proactiveness from energy companies. I'd like to believe that if you rang your energy company and said, we really want to monitor our energy use and reduce it, like you say you want to in your adverts, would you come in and quote us for some sub-meters? I've heard wildly different stories from different people in different areas where people are happy to have, energy companies are happy to install sub-meters. They're not vastly expensive to have installed by electricians, sort of, suitably qualified electricians. It's about whether they are good enough for a deck. Now, what is good enough for a deck is up for debate as well, really, in that all decks have to be based on documented meter readings and energy readings. If it's a sub-meter that you're going to read yourself, that's not good enough. That's why it tends to have to be an energy company installed affair.
But data logger stuff, data loggers for other types of data are relatively inexpensive these days. That, just basically a microprocessor and a sensor that you can plug into your network and get data spooled up at whatever rate you want.
Yeah, I mean, I am not sure, and I would have to look up whether there was talk about creating a list of approved devices. Whether that ever came to fruition or not, I don't know. In my experience, it is only energy service providers' data that will be acceptable, but that may change. I think that is, though, something that's relevant to the deck pool and the Green Venues database, but also this measure tool operated by Julie's Bicycle and University of Oxford, and that does allow you, if you have perhaps less than deck standard sub-meters, it will still allow you to put your sub-meter information in on the basis it's of no use to you to make it up or skew the data. So I think using the sub-meters at that level will still tell you a lot about your building. Whether it ultimately informs your display energy certificate is difficult to say, but if you're actually still using it as a tool for energy management within your building, then that's all to the good.
The other thing that I've heard some particular theatres talk about is that their wiring is behind that much of concrete or particular kinds of heritage finishes that they just can't get at it, or it's prohibitively expensive to get at it. So yeah, a couple of theatres that I've been speaking to would love to understand how much the stage is using to compare to front of house. But
if they've got breakers, then it's at the breaker box.
We've done quite a bit of work at Royal Opera House, looking at sub-metering, because we just have a huge lump of energy that comes in, and we've spoken about this in our recent report from Aaron. And its cost, and its complexity and scale of the building, I think, and what period it was last rewired is going to inform a lot of people. I mean, my colleague here, Robbins, from a lighting perspective, we've been looking at capturing the data coming out of the DMX side so that we can make, considered decisions about energy management, because that's what the sub-metering needs to provide. And yes, we could do some basic sub-metering in the building, most probably quite cheaply with the energy company, but it wouldn't give us enough information about building management and areas of the building, which is our big problem. And so we're looking at other ways. And we how long did the Arabs do was it a 6-week period that they benchmarked us for that report. And we just put local sub-metering in, you know, in different areas, so we could capture a picture of the rep at the time and what was being used in the catering, what was being used on the production power and each area. But I mean, it's a big problem for us because, you know, when we started on the sort of going down the environmental route, my first thing and conversations we had were about sub-metering, so we've got true data and facts to work from and not just assumptions, you know. It's a big problem for us.
I think as well that if you've got time and facilities, if you break it down into small blocks and do it over a small time, you can pick up a domestic energy monitor for 20 quid, which clicks around an incoming total. So you can kind of do your own sub-metering as well.
There are some really powerful
easy solutions as well, they're cheap. It depends what level you want to go to.
Yeah, there are powerful and relatively inexpensive tools, like you say, and if you're a building with a technical department who are pretty, you know, I mean, you know, happy to get their hands dirty and just dig out that distribution board and clamp round it for a week or two, can tell you an enormous amount. We use some data loggers as part of the eco venue project, and what it will tell you about what goes on in your building when you're not there is phenomenal. When you think you know what's happening, you know during the day, people kind of say, oh look, I've done a kettle on, it goes up a bit. Well, it would do, but you know that. It's what happens when you're not there. That's what's fascinating. And potentially will, you know, save you a lot of money and time, and ultimately will contribute to you getting a better DEC score the following year, or theoretically improving your DEC score. Less energy will result in a, you know, in moving you up that scale.
Can I just help by putting a figure that we've got together? We got a quote for 37 metres to pinpoint areas of the building and link that into our BMS. And that just came onto £100,000 to install those and link them in. So that's...
There is an argument that says if you are prepared to make the initial investment on sub-metering, especially if you're a high energy user, that will ultimately allow you to go back to your energy company with a presentation of data and say, actually, we can now renegotiate our electricity contract because we can tell you what our demands are because we've been meeting it, and sometimes those savings that you can make on renegotiating that contract will in fact pay for the initial sub-metering installation.
Particularly reducing the peak, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of cost, we've just had the what we thought was inadequate metering on our building improved. That cost us £2,000,
Right.
Which was relatively expensive because it was quite a difficult job getting into the switchgear to put the current transformers and so on. But I think the breakdown that you had earlier about the amount of energy that's used on stage lighting was very interesting because it was a very small figure, 9%, 10%?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that actually tied in with some rule of thumb calculations that were done ourselves in trying to assess how good our metering was. A couple of us just walked around and did estimates on how much energy was being used in particular areas. And we came out with figures that were quite widely different and quite widely different from what the metering was saying. But one thing that we both agreed on was that in fact the stage lighting wasn't a huge part of our energy use. Because although it's a high peak load when it's there, it's only
not there very much.
Performance on. And even during any given performance, you've only got lots of lights on for a relatively short period of time, depending on what sort of shows you're doing.
I think that's a fair point.
It's easy to get hung up.
And I think it came up at a meeting that Nick and I were at last week, that the more inroads people make into the 35% and the 28%, the more that 9% will start to be more a part of the overall energy use. But you're right, at the moment, it's not the heavy front end that some people think.
You also need to bear in mind that it generates heat which needs to be removed from the building.
Yeah.
I was saying winter, that would
Yeah. Well, actually, but I mean, the ridiculous thing about the television centre that the BBC are moving out of is that it was designed to gather the heat from the studios and use it to heat the building.
Yeah.
That was in the 60s. because energy costs were considered to be expensive at that point. But then energy costs go down, and that sort of architectural consideration goes out the window.
Yes, that's true. And I think although some areas or some venues have looked at the idea of heat recovery from grids, it's such a specific and short part of the day that it's not specially worth the installation necessarily, although I know that the Orange Tree in Richmond, for example, do have a heat recovery system to recover heat from the auditorium and stage areas. So it's being done. Sorry.
Chris Rees, formerly in theatre facilities management, have just been studying environmental management, particularly in events. I noticed from your list, the IG list, that the majority, or a large percentage of those venues are actually arenas. Is this perhaps because the music industry has taken on the sustainability that more favourably than the theatres have, or is it perhaps down to the age of the building? Because presumably the majority of those arenas are recently built or refurbished.
With those organisations that have already done it, I think there's something about the larger venues can handle the cost of just having someone who cares enough to go through the process. And I guess particularly with the 4 Live Nation arenas, that there's been that, you know, group understanding that this was something important that they wanted to do. And I think that's really why there's, at the moment, that preponderance of arenas. Well, sorry, the 5 with Wembley. I think really that's just it's sort of in a way an accident really of just who the initial people have been, and that within a year that list will be a much wider, will show a much wider variety of types of venues and management. We've got the, for example, ATG, you know, trialling it with one of their theatres with the expectation that they'll just roll it out to all of their theatres. So, you know, there'll be all of them added to the list, which will obviously be, you know, should really change the makeup of the list very much. So I think at the moment it's just been it's a reflection really of those organisations that have just been prepared to kind of take that risk on really and be one of the first, you know, leading organisations. But we're, you know, hoping many more will join them soon.
I'm aware that time is pushing on, and I don't want to get rid of you, but is there anything that anyone else would like to bring up while we're here and while we're about it?
Just think one thing to say on energy monitoring is we were quite surprised how high our overnight baseline energy consumption was, so we're trying to cut something, turn stuff off overnight. So, you know, it's a key thing for us.
I really agree. And just also note, one of the venues we've looked at that managed to sub-meter, using that information intelligently, because they started reporting to the different departments who was using what, and catering managed to reduce their energy use 25% in a year. That was just through behaviour. Yeah, if savings like that are possible, then it's definitely worth it.
It's sort of information as well as behaviour. I think the Students' Union last year were doing something called Carbon Ambassadors, and they were going out and working with small community venues. But first of all, they did their own universities, and 2 of the major universities discovered that they had areas of the building that were using air conditioning 365 days a year, and it was actually closed for 4 months in the summer. And a lot of people had BMS but didn't actually know how to operate it. What's happening was that people were taking on a job from somebody else, not being given any training, and they got the information, they got the facilities to take the information, but weren't using it properly.
BMSs that people don't know how to use are going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger problem, because like you say, when there's handover, it doesn't become handed over. Yeah. Is that a hand? No? No? Hair twirl. I think at that stage, we'll draw it to a close.